On a Tuesday morning in October of 1987, a man named Delmar Ostrander stood in the gravel lot behind his machine shop in Chickasaw County, Iowa, and watched a flatbed truck pull away with the last hub he would ever order from the Whitmore Foundry in Dubuque. He didn't know it was the last one. Nobody did. The driver waved from the cab window, and Delmar raised 2 fingers off the top of the fence post he was leaning on, and that was that. The truck turned south onto the county road and disappeared behind the tree line, and Delmar stood there another minute, looking at nothing in particular before he went back inside. That hub was a rear wheel hub for a 1952 Oliver 88 row crop tractor, cast iron, 11 inches across the mounting face, weighing 41 pounds, and it cost Delmar $14.30 including freight. He put it on the shelf in the back room with the others, wrote the date and the part number on a strip of masking tape, and stuck the tape to the side of the casting the way he always did. Let me tell you about Delmar Ostrander, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did with the next 14 years of his life, and what those 14 years made possible on a February morning in 2001 that nobody in Chickasaw County has ever quite stopped talking about. Delmar was 61 years old in 1987. He had been running Ostrander Machine and Salvage on the same 6 acres off County Road B 47 for 33 years, since he came back from Korea with 2 fingers missing on his left hand and a mechanical aptitude that the Army had been kind enough to sharpen into something useful. His father had run a blacksmith operation on the same ground before that, and his grandfather before that had shod horses and repaired wagon wheels on the same patch of Chickasaw County clay going back to 1901. The shop had changed its name 3 times and its equipment a dozen times, but the 6 acres had never changed hands, and neither had the philosophy that governed them. You kept things. You kept them organized. You kept them because the day would come when someone needed exactly what you had, and if you had thrown it away the week before, you were not much use to anybody. Delmar was not a man who wasted words or motion. He was 5'9", broad through the shoulders with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same cast iron he worked with every day. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt in every season, and in winter he added a lined canvas chore coat that had been olive green once and was now the color of field mud. He had a way of standing very still when he was thinking, the way a heron stands still in shallow water, and people who did not know him sometimes mistook this stillness for slowness. They were wrong about that. Delmar Ostrander had forgotten more about agricultural iron than most men ever learned, and he had forgotten it only because his mind was so full of what he still remembered that some of it had to spill over the sides. The machine shop served the farms within a 20-mile radius the way a rural hospital serves a county. Quietly, without fanfare, and with a competence that people only fully appreciated when they needed it most. Delmar did welding, boring, line boring, shaft turning, bearing replacement, and a dozen other operations that kept aging equipment running long past the date when the dealerships had stopped stocking parts for it. He also kept the salvage yard, which occupied the back 3 acres behind the shop, and which contained, by 1987, the stripped remains of over 200 tractors, combines, planters, and pieces of farm equipment going back to the 1920s. Rows of axle housings, stacks of wheel weights, shelves of PTO shafts and hydraulic cylinders and carburetor bodies in varying states of completeness, and, increasingly, hubs. Let me tell you about the hubs, because that is really where this story lives. A wheel hub on a farm tractor is not a glamorous component. It is the cast iron or steel casting that connects the wheel to the axle, and it takes a tremendous amount of punishment over the life of a machine. Mud, corrosion, impact loads, the slow grinding of bearings that have gone dry, the violence of a rear wheel dropping into a ditch at speed, all of it passes through the hub. On older tractors, the hubs were cast iron, thick-walled, heavy, and nearly indestructible under normal conditions. But nearly is not the same as completely, and 30 years of farming will find the limits of nearly every time. Hubs cracked. Hubs stripped their lug nut threads from years of over-torquing by men in a hurry. Hubs corroded from the inside out when water got between the casting and the axle and had nowhere to go. And when a hub failed on an older tractor, an Oliver, an Alice Chalmers, a Minneapolis Moline, a Farmall, the farmer had 3 options. He could find a used one in a salvage yard. He could find a new old stock casting from a supplier who still had them. Or he could park the tractor. Delmar understood this arithmetic better than anyone in Chickasaw County. He had watched the foundries that cast agricultural iron close one by one through the 1970s and into the 1980s, as the farm economy contracted and the old equipment became officially obsolete in the eyes of everyone except the men who still depended on it. The Whitmore Foundry in Dubuque had been one of the last. They had kept casting hubs and axle components for pre-1960 equipment long after it made obvious commercial sense to do so, because the Whitmore family had been casting agricultural iron since 1908, and they understood what it meant to a farmer to keep a machine running. But by 1987, even the Whitmore family had reached the limits of what stubbornness could sustain against economics, and they were winding down. Delmar knew this. He had known it for 2 years before it happened, because he talked to people and he listened, which were 2 skills that served him better than any piece of equipment he owned. He had been ordering hubs from the Whitmore Foundry in increasing quantities since 1985, buying more than he needed for his current customers, filling the backroom shelves with castings wrapped in brown paper and labeled in his precise block handwriting. His wife, Lorraine, thought he was losing his mind. She said so at supper one evening in the spring of 1986, not unkindly, but directly, the way she said most things. She said, "Delmar, you have got $400 tied up in iron that nobody has asked you for yet." He said, "They will." She looked at him for a moment and then went back to her supper, because she had been married to him for 38 years, and she had learned the difference between the times when he was guessing and the times when he knew. He kept ordering. Through 1986 and into 1987, every time a Whitmore truck made a delivery run anywhere near Chickasaw County, Delmar had a standing order waiting. He bought rear hubs for Oliver 88s and 77s and Super 88s. He bought front hubs for Alice Chalmers WDs and WD 45s. He bought the rear axle hub assemblies for the Minneapolis Moline U and Z series that had been the workhorses of the flat corn country north of New Hampton for 2 decades. He bought hubs he wasn't entirely sure he'd ever sell, because the alternative was not buying them, and not buying them meant they would not exist when someone needed them. When the Whitmore Foundry in Dubuque closed its doors in November of 1987, 6 weeks after that last flatbed truck pulled away from Delmar's lot, he had accumulated 247 hubs on those backroom shelves. 247 castings, representing 41 different part numbers, representing the rear and front wheel attachment points for 9 different tractor models that were still being worked every day on farms within 50 miles of his shop. He had spent, over those 2 years of buying, a little over $3,000 on iron that his neighbors considered surplus, obsolete, and mildly eccentric. Now, let me tell you about what the neighbors were doing with their hubs in those same years, because that is the other half of this story and you need both halves to understand what happened later. The farms around New Hampton and Ionia and Fredericksburg in Chickasaw County were not wealthy farms in 1987. The farm crisis of the early 1980s had hit this part of Iowa the way a hard frost hits a garden, thoroughly and without mercy. Land values had collapsed. Operating loans had come due on equipment purchased at the peak of the boom. Families that had farmed the same ground for 3 and 4 generations had lost it to the banks in foreclosure sales that the county courthouse processed with the grim efficiency of an assembly line. The farms that survived were the ones run by men and women who had kept their debt load manageable and their equipment running through pure mechanical stubbornness. These survivors were, almost without exception, running old iron, not because they preferred it, but because they could not afford to replace it, and because a paid-off Oliver 88 with a cracked hub was still more valuable than a brand-new John Deere with a payment due every month. So they brought their cracked hubs and their stripped hubs and their corroded hubs to Delmar Ostrander's shop on County Road B47, and Delmar fixed what could be fixed and replaced what could not be fixed. And when he replaced them, he reached into those backroom shelves and pulled out a casting wrapped in brown paper and handed it across the counter. He charged fair prices. He charged what the parts cost him plus a reasonable margin for his time and his storage and his foresight, which he never called foresight because that would have been immodest. He called it having things on hand. His customers called it a lifesaver, usually at the moment when they were looking at a cracked hub on a Tuesday afternoon with corn waiting in the field and rain in the forecast for Thursday, and Delmar was already walking toward the back room. This went on for 14 years. Let me tell you about those 14 years, because they are not a footnote to this story. They are the story. From 1987 to 2001, Delmar Ostrander sold hubs. Not all the time. He had a full machine shop to run, and the hub business was a fraction of his work. But steadily, the way water moves through good soil, the hubs moved off those shelves and onto tractors. A rear hub for Virgil Gustafson's Oliver 88 in the spring of 1989, when Virgil cracked his original getting the tractor out of a frozen ditch in February and needed it replaced before planting. A pair of front hubs for the Peterson brothers' Alice Chalmers WD-45 in 1991, when they discovered the originals had been corroding from the inside for years and were down to maybe a 1/4 inch of sound metal on the mounting face. A Minneapolis Moline rear hub for old Clement Hassel up on the ridge north of Ionia in 1994. Who had been running his U-Series on the same ground his father broke in 1938 and was not about to stop because of a hub. Each time, Delmar went to the back room. Each time, he found what he needed on those shelves. Each time, he wrote the sale in his ledger in the same precise block handwriting, noted the date and the customer and the part number, and peeled the masking tape label off the casting before he handed it over. The shelf got a little emptier. The ledger got a little fuller. The farmers went back to their fields. By the spring of 2000, Delmar had sold 231 of his original 247 hubs. He had 16 left, representing 7-part numbers, and he had not been able to restock any of them because the Whitmore Foundry had been closed for 13 years, and nobody else was casting that iron. He had tried. He had made calls to foundries in Illinois and Wisconsin and Ohio, sent drawings and sample castings, gotten polite responses, and then silence. The quantities were too small. The tooling costs were too high. The market was too thin. Nobody was going to cast 41-pound agricultural hubs for pre-1960 Oliver tractors in quantities of 10 or 20. It was not a business. It was a favor, and foundries had stopped doing favors. So Delmar had 16 hubs, and he knew, the way he had known in 1985 that the Whitmore Foundry was winding down, that those 16 were probably all that existed in usable condition within 100 miles. Maybe more. The used ones in salvage yards were the stripped and cracked ones that had been pulled off tractors because they had failed. The good ones were either on tractors or on his shelves, and the ones on his shelves were getting fewer. He stopped advertising them, not dishonestly. If someone came to him and needed a hub he sold it. But he stopped mentioning them to people who were just browsing, stopped putting them in the newsletter he sent to his regular customers twice a year, stopped pointing them out to the dealers and repair shops that occasionally called looking for parts. He was not hoarding. He was being careful, the way a man is careful with the last of something irreplaceable. He had no way of knowing that the phone call was coming in February of 2001, but he was ready for it when it did. Now, let me tell you about the other side of this story, because there was a man in Chickasaw County in those same 14 years who was doing almost exactly the opposite of what Delmar Ostrander was doing, and understanding that man is what makes the February morning make sense. His name was Randy Crowley, and he ran the Crowley Farm Equipment dealership on the south edge of New Hampton, which was the largest agricultural equipment dealer in Chickasaw County, and had been since Randy's father opened it in 1968. Randy had taken over from his father in 1983, and had built the business aggressively through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, adding a service department, a precision agriculture division, and a GPS guidance system installation service that was, in 1998 and 1999, doing very well. Randy Crowley was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from being the biggest operation in a small market. He drove a clean half-ton pickup and wore a Crowley Farm Equipment cap that was always new enough to still have its shape. Randy's dealership did not stock parts for equipment older than 15 years. This was a business decision, and it was not an unreasonable one. Old parts tied up capital, took up shelf space, and turned over slowly. The farmers who needed them were not, as a rule, the farmers buying new equipment, and new equipment was where the margins were. Randy had made this decision formally in 1991, when he had done an inventory analysis and found that 20% of his shelf space was occupied by parts that accounted for less than 3% of his parts revenue. He had cleared that inventory out in a liquidation sale that fall, selling the old stock at cost to get it off the books, and had reinvested the shelf space in precision agriculture components and hydraulic fittings for current model equipment. Some of what he sold at that liquidation sale were hubs, old hubs, the kind that fit the pre-1960 iron that was still running on the farms around New Hampton. He sold them for $3 a piece, which was what they had cost him in the early 1980s when he ordered them from the Whitmore Foundry before they closed. He sold them to whoever would take them. Some went to farmers. Some went to a salvage dealer from Waterloo who bought old parts in bulk and resold them at swap meets. Some, almost certainly, went to Delmar Ostrander, though Randy did not know that at the time and would not have particularly cared if he had. Randy Crowley was not a bad man. He was a practical man, and in the agricultural equipment business in the 1990s, practical meant focusing on what was selling and letting go of what wasn't. He had a payroll to meet and a floor plan to service and a GPS division that needed his attention. He did not have time to be sentimental about cast iron hubs for Oliver 88s. He also had a way of talking about Delmar Ostrander that was not quite dismissive and not quite respectful, which is a tone that people in small communities develop for the person they cannot entirely figure out. Randy would say, when someone asked about getting a part for an older machine, that they could try Delmar out on B47, that Delmar had a lot of old stuff out there, that Delmar was good for that kind of thing. He said it the way you direct someone to a pawn shop. Helpfully, but with a slight implication that needing a pawn shop is a step below needing a real store. In the fall of 2000, Randy Crowley bought 6 Oliver 88 tractors at an estate sale in Mitchell County. The estate was the Borgman farm, which had been operated by Heinrich Borgman until his death in August at the age of 89, and which his children, none of whom farmed, were liquidating as quickly and completely as possible. The 6 Oliver 88s were part of a larger lot of equipment that Randy bought for $11,000, intending to clean them up and resell them individually at a profit. It was not the kind of deal he usually did. His dealership sold new equipment, but the price was right, and he had a customer in mind for 2 of the tractors, a hobby farmer south of New Hampton who collected vintage iron and had been asking Randy to keep an eye out. Randy had the 6 tractors hauled to his lot and lined up in a row along the south fence. His service manager, a man named Doug Sievert, who had been with the dealership for 11 years, went through them one by one to assess what they needed before Randy priced them for resale. Doug was thorough. He checked compression, hydraulics, steering, brakes, and electrical. He also checked the hubs. 5 of the 6 tractors had hubs in acceptable condition. The 6th, the one that had been Borgman's primary field tractor, the one with the most hours on it, the one that still had mud in the wheel wells from the last time it had been run, had 2 rear hubs that were cracked. Not hairline cracks, full structural cracks running from the lug bolt holes across the mounting face, the kind of cracks that meant the hub was a safety hazard and could not legally or responsibly be put back into service. The tractor was otherwise in remarkable condition. Borgman had kept his equipment with the kind of attention that comes from having lived through the Depression and understanding that a machine you take care of will outlast a machine you don't. The engine was tight. The hydraulics were strong. The sheet metal was straight. But the rear hubs were done. Doug Sievert told Randy Crowley about the hubs on a Monday morning in November of 2000. Randy told him to find replacements. Doug made calls. He called every part supplier in his network, every salvage yard in northeast Iowa, every dealer he knew who handled vintage equipment. He found plenty of people who knew what he was talking about. He found nobody who had the hubs. The Whitmore Foundry had been closed for 13 years. The aftermarket suppliers who had briefly filled the gap in the early 1990s had stopped stocking the parts when demand dried up. The salvage yards had stripped hubs, the cracked and worn ones that had been pulled off tractors because they'd failed, but not sound ones. Nobody had sound Oliver 88 rear hubs, nobody except Delmar Ostrander. Doug Sievert knew this because two of his service customers had mentioned Delmar's name in the past year when they'd needed old parts. He drove out to the shop on County Road B47 on a Wednesday afternoon in late November, introduced himself to Delmar, and asked about Oliver 88 rear hubs. Delmar looked at him for a moment with that still Heron quality, and then said he might have something and went to the back room. He came back with one hub, unwrapped the brown paper, and set it on the counter. It was perfect. Sound cast-in, no cracks, no corrosion, threads clean. Doug asked how many Delmar had. Delmar said he had a few. Doug asked if he could buy 2. Delmar said he would have to think about it. Doug Sievert went back to the dealership and told Randy Crowley that the old guy out on B47 had the hubs, but was being cagey about how many. Randy said he'd handle it himself and called Delmar that evening. Now, let me pause here and tell you about that phone call, because it is where this story takes the turn that makes it worth telling. Randy Crowley called Delmar Ostrander at 7:15 on a Wednesday evening in November of 2000. Delmar was at the kitchen table with Lorraine, finishing supper. He got up and took the call in the shop, the way he always took business calls, sitting on the stool behind the parts counter with a notepad in front of him. Randy introduced himself and explained the situation with the Borgman tractor. He said he needed 2 Oliver 88 rear hubs, that he understood Delmar might have some, and that he'd like to buy them. He was polite and businesslike. Then he said something that was also polite and businesslike, but that contained, underneath its politeness, a particular kind of assumption. He said he assumed Delmar had more than he needed, given that the market for that kind of part was pretty thin these days, and that he'd be happy to take them off his hands at a fair price. Delmar wrote something on the notepad. Then he said, "I've got 3 of that number." Randy said, "Great, I only need 2. Delmar said, "I know. I'm telling you, I've got 3, so you understand that selling you 2 leaves me 1. And I want to think about whether I want to be down to 1. There was a pause on Randy's end of the line. Then Randy said, with the slightly strained patience of a man accustomed to transactions proceeding more directly, that he understood, and that he'd pay a fair price, and that he didn't think Delmar would be selling many more Oliver 88 rear hubs at this point, anyway, given that the tractors were 50 years old. Delmar said, "That's an interesting way to look at it." Randy said, "What do you mean?" Delmar said, "You've got 6 Oliver 88s on your lot right now. You told me one of them needs rear hubs. I'm wondering about the other 5. There was another pause. Randy said the other 5 had been checked and were fine. Delmar said, "Checked how?" Randy said his service manager had gone through them. Delmar said, "Cast iron cracks from the inside out sometimes. You can't always see it from the outside." Has Doug put a light inside those hub bores and looked at the mounting face from the back? Randy said he didn't know exactly what Doug had done. Delmar said, "I'd suggest finding out before you sell those tractors. Because if one of them has a hub that looks fine from the outside and isn't fine from the inside and somebody gets hurt, that's going to be a problem for you." There was a longer pause this time. Randy said he'd have Doug take another look. Then he said, "So will you sell me the 2 hubs?" Delmar said he would sell him 2 hubs at $40 apiece, which was his standard price, and that Randy could send someone to pick them up Thursday morning. Randy said $40 seemed high for a 50-year-old part. Delmar said, "It's not high for the only one available. But I'm not charging you for that. I'm charging you $40 because that's what I charge." Randy said he'd send Doug Thursday morning. He did. And when Doug Sievert came Thursday morning, Delmar handed over 2 hubs wrapped in brown paper and took $80 in cash and wrote the sale in his ledger. He also handed Doug a flashlight and told him to tell Randy to use it inside the hub bores on the other 5 tractors before he put them on the lot. Doug looked at the flashlight and then at Delmar and said he'd pass that along. He passed it along. Randy had Doug do the inspection. 2 of the remaining 5 tractors had internal cracking that the initial visual inspection had missed. Exactly the kind of cracking Delmar had described, running across the mounting face from the inside, invisible from the outside until the casting failed. Doug called Delmar back that same afternoon and said they needed 4 more hubs. Delmar said he had 1 of that number left and 2 of a related number that would require machining to fit, and that was all he had. Doug said, "What about the other tractors?" Delmar said he didn't have hubs for those. He said the only place he knew of that might have them was a salvage yard in Decorah that he'd been dealing with for 20 years, and he'd make a call if Randy wanted him to. Randy Crowley drove out to the shop on County Road B-47 himself the next morning. It was a Friday in late November, cold enough that the gravel in the lot had frost on the shaded side of each stone, and Randy's breath made clouds in the air as he walked from his truck to the shop door. He had been to Delmar's shop once before, years earlier, and he had forgotten how much iron was back there in the salvage yard. The rows of axle housings and wheel weights and stripped frames going back to equipment his father would have recognized. He stopped for a moment and looked at it before he went inside. Delmar was at the lathe when Randy came in. He finished what he was doing, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and came to the counter. Randy explained that he needed to solve the hub problem on the remaining tractors and that he wanted Delmar's help doing it. He said he was willing to pay for Delmar's time and expertise. He said it straightforwardly, without the slight condescension of the phone call, and Delmar noticed the difference. Delmar said he'd make some calls. He made calls over the next 2 weeks. He found 3 more usable hubs, 1 in Decorah, 1 at a swap meet contact in Wisconsin, 1 in the back of a retired machinist's garage in Dubuque, who had bought it from the Whitmore Foundry liquidation sale in 1987 and kept it because he couldn't bear to throw away good iron. Delmar arranged to have all 3 shipped to his shop, inspected them, and sold them to Randy Crowley at his standard price. The 2 hubs that required machining to fit, he machined himself, charging his standard shop rate for the work. In the end, Randy Crowley got all 6 Oliver 88s into saleable condition. He sold 4 of them at prices between $1,800 and $2,200 each, and the hobby farmer south of New Hampton bought the other 2 for a combined $3,800. The total return on his $11,000 investment was just over $14,000, a profit of $3,000. And it was a profit that would not have existed without Delmar Ostrander's backroom shelves and his 20-year network of people who kept things. But that is not the part of this story that people in Chickasaw County still talk about. Let me tell you about the morning in February of 2001, because that is the part that people still talk about. It was the 2nd week of February, a Thursday, and the temperature had been below 0 for 4 days running. Delmar was in the shop doing paperwork when the phone rang. It was a farmer named Emmett Lindgren who ran 600 acres of corn and soybeans north of Ionia and had been a Delmar Ostrander customer for 20 years. Emmett was not a man who panicked, but his voice on the phone that morning had an edge to it that Delmar recognized as controlled urgency. Emmett said he had a problem. He said he had an Oliver 88 that he used exclusively for his grain auger in the winter, running the PTO to move grain from the bins to the truck, and that the rear hub had cracked overnight, he thought from the cold, and that he had a grain buyer coming on Monday morning to take delivery of 12,000 bushels of corn, and without that auger running he could not move the corn, and if he could not move the corn on Monday, he was going to lose the sale because the buyer had a full schedule and could not reschedule until April, and April was too late because Emmett needed the cash from this sale to make his operating loan payment in March. Delmar listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he asked Emmett what the hub number was. Emmett read it off the cracked casting. It was the number of the one hub Delmar had left, the one he had kept back when he sold Randy Crowley 2 of his 3. Delmar said, "I've got one." Emmett said, "One is all I need." Delmar said, "I know. Come get it this afternoon." Emmett Lindgren drove to the shop that afternoon, paid $40 for the hub, drove home, and had his son help him install it that evening in the unheated machine shed with trouble lights hung from the rafters and their breath fogging in the cold. The installation took 3 hours. On Monday morning, the grain buyer arrived at 7 o'clock. The Oliver 88 started on the second pull of the rope, and 12,000 bushels of corn moved from Emmett Lindgren's bins to the buyer's trucks over the course of 6 hours. The sale was $41,000. Emmett made his loan payment in March with 11 days to spare. He called Delmar the following week to tell him this, because he thought Delmar should know. Delmar said he was glad it worked out. Emmett said he didn't know what he would have done if Delmar hadn't had that hub. Delmar said, "Well, I had it." Emmett said, "How long have you had it?" Delmar said, "Since October of 1987. Emmett said, "You've been holding that hub for 14 years. Delmar said, "I've been holding it until somebody needed it." Emmett said, "How did you know somebody would need it?" Delmar said, "I didn't know who. I just knew somebody would." Now, let me tell you about what happened after, because this story has a shape that goes beyond one hub and one Monday morning grain sale, and you need to see the whole shape to understand what Delmar Ostrander actually built in those 33 years on County Road B47. Word got around, the way word gets around in a county of 12,000 people, where everyone knows everyone's equipment problems. The story of Emmett Lindgren's hub and his $41,000 corn sale made its way through the coffee shops and the co-op and the grain elevator and the implement dealer's waiting room, the way useful stories always do in small communities, because useful stories are currency and people spend them freely. People who had not thought much about Delmar's salvage yard or his backroom shelves began to think about them differently. The man who had been quietly described as good for that kind of thing began to be described as the man who had the part when nobody else did, which is a different description entirely and carries a different weight. Randy Crowley heard the story too. He heard it at the co-op in early March, from a farmer who had heard it from Emmett's neighbor, and he stood at the counter with his coffee and listened to it all the way through without saying anything. Then he drove out to County Road B47 for the second time in 3 months. Delmar was in the yard when Randy pulled in, moving some axle housings with the shop's old Ford loader tractor. He finished what he was doing, parked the tractor, and walked over to where Randy was standing by his truck. Randy said he'd heard about the Lindgren hub. Delmar said he'd heard. Randy said he wanted to ask Delmar something. He said, "How many other parts do you have back there that nobody knows about?" Delmar looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "All of them?" Randy said, "What do you mean, all of them?" Delmar said, "I mean, every part back there is a part that somebody doesn't know I have until they need it. That's how it works. You don't know you need a part until the one on your machine breaks, and then you need it immediately, and if nobody has it, you're in trouble. So, somebody has to have it before you know you need it." Randy said, "How do you know what to keep?" Delmar said, "You keep what was made in quantity for machines that are still running. You keep it organized so you can find it. You keep it protected so it doesn't deteriorate. And you keep it long enough that the people who threw theirs away start needing yours." Randy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I sold a bunch of old hub stock at a liquidation sale in 1991. $3 apiece." Delmar said, "I know. I bought some of them." Randy looked at him. He said, "You bought my liquidation stock?" Delmar said, "Some of it. Not all. I already had most of what you were selling, but there were a few numbers you had that I didn't." Randy said, "And you've been selling them since then." Delmar said, "When people needed them." Randy stood there in the cold March air of that gravel lot and looked at the rows of iron in the salvage yard behind the shop, and Delmar could see him doing a kind of arithmetic in his head. The arithmetic of what those parts had been worth at $3 apiece in 1991 and what they were worth now, and what the difference between those two numbers represented in terms of judgment and patience and the willingness to hold something until it mattered. It was not a comfortable arithmetic for a man who had built his business on turning inventory quickly. Randy said, "I owe you an apology." Delmar said, "For what?" Randy said, "For the way I talked about you, to customers. You know how I talked about you." Delmar said, "I know how you talked about me." Randy said, "I said you were good for that kind of thing, like it was a lesser thing." Delmar said, "It is a lesser thing to some people. It was a lesser thing to you until you needed it." Randy said, "That's fair." Delmar said, "It's not about fair. It's about what's true. You built a good business selling new equipment to people who could buy new equipment. That's a real service. I built a different business keeping old equipment running for people who couldn't afford new. Both things need to exist. The problem is when the person doing one of them thinks the other one doesn't matter." Randy said, "I thought it didn't matter." Delmar said, "I know you did." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was honest in the way that silences between men who have just said true things to each other tend to be honest. Then Randy said he wanted to talk about whether there was a way to work together, whether Delmar would be willing to be a resource for the dealership when customers came in needing parts for older equipment, whether they could build some kind of arrangement. Delmar said he was willing to talk about it. He said he had always been willing to talk about it, that nobody had ever asked before. They talked for an hour in the cold, standing by Randy's truck, and by the end of it they had the outline of an arrangement that was simple and sensible. Randy's service department would call Delmar first when a customer needed a part for equipment older than 1965, and Delmar would tell them honestly whether he had it or could find it, and if he could, he'd supply it at his standard price with a modest finder's fee to the dealership for the referral. It was not a formal partnership. It was two men in a county deciding to stop working around each other and start working with each other, which is a thing that should probably have happened 15 years earlier and didn't, because one of them had not yet needed the other badly enough to ask. The arrangement worked. Over the next several years, Randy Crowley's service department sent Delmar Ostrander, a steady stream of customers with old equipment parts needs, and Delmar supplied them with the same quiet competence he had always supplied his direct customers, and the dealership's reputation for being able to help with older equipment improved, and Delmar's shop got busier. It was not a transformation. It was a correction. The kind of correction that happens when a community finally aligns itself with what is actually true about its needs. Let me tell you about Delmar Ostrander in his last years on County Road B47, because the story doesn't end with the arrangement, and it doesn't end with the hub, and it doesn't even end with Delmar. Delmar ran the shop until he was 78 years old, which was 2004. He did not retire so much as slow down, turning more of the machine work over to a young man named Caleb Steinmetz, who had come to him at 22 looking for a job and had stayed because he was one of those rare young men who understood immediately that what Delmar knew was worth learning. Caleb had grown up on a farm in Hardin County and had a mechanical aptitude that reminded Delmar, in his more reflective moments, of himself at that age. The same patience, the same willingness to look at a broken thing and think before acting. The same instinct that the answer was usually already in the shop somewhere if you knew where to look. Delmar spent his last years at the shop doing what he had always been best at: organizing, cataloging, and knowing. He went through the salvage yard systematically, something he had been meaning to do for years, and created a written inventory of every part in every row, cross-referenced by tractor model and part number and condition. He did this by hand, in a series of composition notebooks, in the same precise block handwriting he had used for 50 years. When he finished, he had filled 9 notebooks and documented over 4,000 individual parts. He gave the notebooks to Caleb and told him they were the real value of the business, more than the equipment, more than the building, more than the customer list. He said, "The machines are worth what someone will pay for them. The knowledge of what the machines need is worth whatever it takes to keep them running." Don't confuse the two. Caleb Steinmetz did not confuse the two. He still runs Ostrander Machine and Salvage on County Road B47. The sign out front still says Ostrander, because Caleb understood that the name was part of what people were coming for, and changing it would have been like changing the address of a church. The 9 composition notebooks are in a fireproof cabinet behind the parts counter. The salvage yard is larger now than it was when Delmar ran it, because Caleb has the same instinct for keeping things that Delmar had, and he has had 20 years to act on it. Delmar Ostrander died in the spring of 2009 at the age of 83, in the house on the same 6 acres where he had worked for 55 years. Lorraine had died the year before, and the people who knew them both said that Delmar had spent his last year with a quietness about him that was different from his usual quietness. Not sad exactly, but finished, the way a field looks after the last harvest of the season when everything that was going to grow has grown and been taken in. His funeral was at the Methodist Church in New Hampton, and the parking lot was full of pickup trucks, and several of the men who came had driven more than an hour because they had needed something from that shop at a critical moment, and Delmar had had it, and they thought that was worth an hour's drive to say goodbye. Randy Crowley came. He sat in the 3rd row and did not speak at the service, but afterward, in the church basement over coffee, he told Caleb Steinmetz a version of the story about the November phone call and the Oliver 88 hubs and the flashlight and the February morning and Emmett Lindgren's corn sale. He told it carefully, getting the details right. The way you tell a story when you want the person you're telling it to understand that it matters. Caleb listened without interrupting. When Randy finished, Caleb said, "He told me about that. He said it was a good example of why you keep things." Randy said, "He was right." Caleb said, "He usually was." There is an Oliver 88 tractor that sits in the back corner of the salvage yard at Ostrander Machine and Salvage, under a corrugated steel lean-to that Caleb built to keep the weather off it. It is not for sale. Caleb will tell you, if you ask, that it was the first tractor Delmar's father bought new in 1952, and that it has been on those 6 acres ever since, and that it still runs. He will tell you that the rear hubs on it are original castings from the Whitmore Foundry in Dubuque, poured in 1952, still sound, still true. He will tell you that every few years someone offers to buy it, and every time he says no, and that he says no for the same reason Delmar said no to things, not because he doesn't know the price, but because he knows the value, and they are not the same number. The 9 composition notebooks are still in the fireproof cabinet. The foundry that cast those hubs has been closed for 37 years, and somewhere in Chickasaw County, on a farm north of Ionia, there's a man named Emmett Lindgren who made a loan payment in March of 2001 because a man on County Road B47 had bought a 41-pound piece of cast iron in October of 1987 and kept it on a shelf for 14 years because he believed that someone would need it. He was right. He was always right about that. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait on a shelf in a back room, wrapped in brown paper, labeled in block handwriting, until the morning someone needs them badly enough to make the call. And some men spend their whole lives making sure that when that morning comes, the answer is already there. That's what Delmar Ostrander built on those 6 acres. Not a salvage yard, not a machine shop, a library of last resorts, organized by a man who understood that the most important part is always the one nobody else thought to keep.